do if nothing else works. How can you press the press? On the specific case of covering human rights issues, I don't know that it's ever been tried. But certainly on other issues, it has been tried, and it works. In fact, it's, very little bits of pressure often have effects. The effects are often slow, but they're nonetheless significant, and if the scale of the efforts were larger, it could be quite significant. Let me tell you one case. Take, say, FAIR, which I mentioned before, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Very good group and really could use support. I think they do terrific work on this issue, the best I know. Very good journal also called Extra, which comes out once a month and tells you a lot about these things. Let me give you one example. Part of the whole media government campaign is that Nicaragua has been sending miraculously undetectable arms to El Salvador. Now, if you read the government propaganda, like the State Department reports, which incidentally were dismissed with complete derision by the world court, but are always accepted by the media, if you read them, you discover that these arms are supposed to be coming across the Gulf of Fonseca. David McMichael, who some of you may know, is the CIA analyst in charge of analyzing this material during the relevant period, the early 80s. He testified at the World Court hearings. He made a couple of interesting observations. He pointed out that the Gulf of Fonseca, if I recall the details correctly, 30 kilometers wide. It has an island in the middle of it, Tiger Island, where the U.S. has some super sophisticated surveillance system. The whole U.S. Navy's floating around in that little area. Navy SEAL teams are all over. The radar can pick things up all the way up and down the Pacific coast and so on and so forth. They've never found a canoe, Well, of course, let's concede that Nicaragua is, kind of like a technological superpower, and the United States is somehow, really, weak little country, so maybe they're getting it through somehow. But that's what we're supposed to believe. If you want to be a loyal citizen, that's what you don't laugh when you see this. Because it's crucial that Nicaragua be supplying arms to the guerrillas. After all, we've got to pretend, that the Contras are guerrillas. Well, the Contras get 3 supply flights a day. No guerrillas in history ever heard of anything like that. They're better armed than the American Army half the time. But somehow they got to be guerrillas. So it must be that the FMLN is a foreign implant too. So they're getting canoes across the Gulf of Fonseca that we can't detect. That's the story. And this story goes on and on. Now, here's where FAIR enters. In August 1987, right after the Central American Accords, when it was crucial to maintain this symmetry idea, James Lemoyne, the New York Times correspondent, wrote something like this. He said, there's ample evidence that the FMLN guerrillas, the Salvadoran guerrillas, are receiving their arms from Nicaragua, and that without that constant flow of arms, they couldn't continue. That's what he wrote. Well, FAIR wrote a letter to the New York Times, simple letter. They said, could you please ask Mr. Lemoyne to share with us his ample evidence, since the U.S. government hasn't been able to come up with it. Well, the letter wasn't printed, but they did get a response from, I think it was Joseph Lelyfeld, who's the foreign editor. Somebody here? No, Joseph, you correct me if I make mistakes here. Yeah. Joseph Lelyfeld was the foreign editor at the Times. He wrote him back a personal letter saying something like, well, maybe Lemoyne exaggerated a little or something like that. Well, after that, he said maybe Lemoyne was imprecise. I mean, that was his word. After that, the Times had ample occasion to correct the imprecision, and they used it, namely by repeating the same falsehood. There's story after story after story saying the same thing by Lemoyne, by others, and so on. FAIR kept after them. Finally, they got a letter from Joseph Lelyfeld, I think it was 3 or 4 months later, saying that he's assigned James Lemoyne to do a story in which he's going to present the ample evidence. Well, 6 months went by, no story. In Extra, the journal of FAIR, there was a small article reporting the facts that I just mentioned, and about 2 months after that, Lemoyne finally had his story, which presented the ample evidence. This is now 9 months after he was assigned to the task, and about, I think, 15 months after the original story came out. You read the story in the Times, turns out the ample evidence has been reduced to no evidence. He says, in fact, if you look at it carefully, it turns out that the arms, he says maybe they're getting some arms from Honduras and Guatemala and places like that, but there don't seem to be any arms from Nicaragua. I took care of the ample evidence. Incidentally, here's an example of fair pressure which worked. Partly, notice it worked because it had become impossible to keep the Contras in the field. As soon as there's a very dramatic difference between the Contras and the FMLN. It takes a disciplined press not to point this out. The Contras were maintained in the field with a level of supply and support that is unheard of, undreamt of in any guerrilla struggle. The FMLN has no known outside support, and somehow they're ineradicable. And they're fighting a military force which on paper at least is stronger than the army of Nicaragua by a big margin. Look at its supplies and stuff. Well, you know, maybe it's another one of these miracles like William Shawcross must be. Actually, it's not a miracle, and if you bother to think for a minute, you'll figure out the answer. But the answer is unacceptable, so therefore, you know, it didn't happen. When Congress said that they weren't going to continue overt military support, the Contras mostly broke for the border, and by late last year, it was impossible to maintain them in the field except at a low level. So then it was legitimate to say, well, you know, maybe they're not getting armed. But here's a case where fair pressure did some work. Well, let me continue with the story where there was no pressure and therefore nothing happened. Last fall, last November, the most important defector yet, to my knowledge, defected, a guy named Horacio Arce, who was the head of FDN intelligence, basically head of counterintelligence. He defected in Honduras, went to Mexico. He was interviewed extensively in Mexico. Not a word appeared in the U.S. press, to my knowledge, except one small press service in Washington, D.C., run by William Robinson, which is now unfortunately defunct as donating money. But you could find the testimony, translations from the Mexican press and so on. And the testimony was very interesting. He had a lot of interesting things to say about all sorts of topics. But one topic was about arms. He said that the Contras are selling their arms to the Honduran army, which is totally corrupt, of course, and the Honduran army is selling them off to the FMLN guerrillas. Well, that meant, if you think for a moment, that in a couple of months, Soviet-style arms were going to appear in El Salvador. The reason is the Contras are supplied with Soviet-style armaments, like Chinese AK-47s and East German this and that and so on. Now, up until now, the FMLN guerrillas had like M16s and American arms because they're taking them from the Salvadoran army. They're buying them or capturing them or something. But you could predict that in a couple of months they're going to have Soviet arms. Well, it happened. 6 months later, big story from the State Department, huge new shipment of Soviet arms from Cuba and Nicaragua and all these bad places, which proves that Gorbachev isn't serious about détente and the Sandinistas are up to their dirty work again, all repeated in the press. Yeah, they got Soviet-style arms because now they're getting it from the Contras, not just from the American army. So the other source of U.S. support is now supplying them. Now there wasn't any pressure about this. Nobody was battering down the media doors saying, why don't you report the testimony of Horacio Arce, who had many other things to say too, incidentally, very illuminating ones, I'll tell you if you like. And there was no pressure, so nothing happened, so then this story came out. Well, that's an indication of things that can be done, and they can be done every day, but it takes work. I mean, they're not going to get done by themselves. It takes work.
In the face of blatant censorship and adversity, I just want to thank you for your years of courage and fortitude in speaking the truth.
Thanks. That makes it worth it.
Hi. My question pertains to something, Susan? I don't know. Pertains to something on which there's more coverage in the mass media. Maybe that should warn me of something right away. But what's your perception of events in the Soviet Union, changes in domestic and foreign policy there, and whether or not a changing perception of the Soviet Union here is going to remove the popular justification of Soviet aggression for our own aggressive foreign policy?
That's a very important question. The question had to do with the changes going on in the Soviet Union, particularly foreign policy, the perceptions of that here, and how that's going to affect the kind of stuff I was quoting before. Remember, say, Huntington's quote about you have to create the misimpression that it's the Soviet Union that you're fighting when you decide to destroy some, some church-based peasant association in El Salvador or whatever. So how's that going to change if the Soviet Union doesn't look so terrifying? Well, that's a very interesting question. The Soviet Union has been necessary for two things in the United States, two crucial things. One, for frightening, really one thing, for frightening the domestic population, and there's two purposes to that. One purpose to that is we have a world empire that we've got to control, and that means control by force. And if we're going to intervene somewhere, then it has to be exactly as Professor Huntington pointed out. It has to be by creating the misimpression that it's the Soviet Union we're fighting. This misimpression, incidentally, runs all the way through U.S. intelligence. I mean, U.S. intelligence is, like most intelligence services, I guess, is fanatically ideological and cannot see the most elementary things, because what it needs, it sees, kind of like educated intellectuals.